Hello, I'm Judith Pinero, Executive Director of the Association of Art Museum Curators and AAMC Foundation, the leading global organization for all nonprofit art curators. On behalf of AAMC Foundation, our partners for this series, the Art Fund, and our speakers, it is a pleasure to welcome you today. Thank you. The AAMC Foundation offices are situated upon the unceded, seized territory of the Lenape and Canarsie peoples, and benefited from the economies of enslaved peoples and the labors of African-descended captives. We owe our existence and vitality to generations from around the world who were brought here against their will, drawn here to escape persecution, and some that have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. We pay respect to their communities, past and present. This acknowledgement asks us each to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together today. AAMC Foundation, along with our partner in this series, the Art Fund, are dedicated to an environment in which all individuals are treated with respect and dignity at our programs, virtual and in person. Each individual, attendee, speaker, staff, has the right to be in a professional atmosphere that prohibits discriminatory practices, including harassment and negative communications. Our full code of conduct, policy for all of our programs, as well as the outlets to make a direct or anonymous report of a violation, is being placed in the chat feature. Art Fund and AAMC Foundation are honored to produce Beyond Statements Revisited series, a follow-up to our original 2020 three-part webinar, which you can watch on YouTube. Together, the Art Fund and AAMC Foundation are committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, access, and belonging as core and central values to all that we do, and believe it is important to return to our 2020 series to update, investigate, unpack, contextualize, and disseminate where the arts community is today within the DEAIB sector. Featuring experts in the field of visual arts, nonprofits, DEAIB, Beyond Statements Revisited began last week with our first session on June 14th, which is again available to view on our YouTube channel. And we'll continue with this session today and conclude next week on June 28th. We are grateful to our attendees for making space in their schedule to join us. We give thanks to our speakers for sharing their experiences and knowledge. And now it is my honor and pleasure to hand it over to Tanya Odom, Program Director, Equity and Inclusion, the Walton Family Foundation, and AAMC Foundation board member, who will be moderating this webinar. Tanya, to you to begin our program, and thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Welcome, everyone. I want to thank the Art Fund, Rachel, Judith at AAMC, and her team, Emma, Cassidy, all for really putting all of this together. I want to introduce our speakers, and just so you know if they can come on camera. What we'll do is I'll give a little bit of an overview of the last 3 years, as if I can do that in 2 minutes. But then we really want to get into a conversation with people who, in fact, are in the roles of whether we're calling it EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, whether we're putting the belonging piece there. We're going to talk a little bit about language as we go on. But I want to just give a brief introduction. You'll see their full bios on the website, and you'll see that link in the chat. But first, we have Ali Jafarey, who's a Quality, Diversity, and Inclusion Lead in the People and Change team at the V&A. Virajita Singh, who's the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Minneapolis Institute of Arts. And Reyahn King, who's actually a consultant, facilitator, and executive coach with extensive experience in the sort of arts organization world. So as Judith just laid out, and those of you who've been attending these sessions, I could do a whole session on sort of what we learned or are learning, I think, in the last 3 years. Language like multiple pandemics, polycrises has been used to describe all of the things that took place after George Floyd's murder and the summer of 2020. It was a global conversation in a way that someone who's been in the space, me, for over 25 years has never seen. And in fact, we know that some of the largest demonstrations, protests, and gatherings were actually outside of the United States. So in addition to sort of this awakening, as some people call it, reckoning, what we saw was an increase in people being put into or hired into roles to lead diversity, equity, and inclusion. Just some data on this. according to some research by LinkedIn, between 2019 and 2021, there was a 169% increase in people having the Chief Diversity Officer language in their title. What's interesting, and we're going to talk about this a little bit too, this role declined by 4.5% in 2022. There's other research that we're seeing in terms of the rolling back of some of these issues. And in fact, just a couple of last notes, some of the recent headlines related to these positions is the CDO, Chief Diversity Officer role, the most perilous role in the C-suite? Where have all the chief diversity officers gone? And one that keeps being circulated every couple of months, how to lose a chief diversity officer in 6 months. I think just to put someone in these roles we all know is not the answer, and that's why we have these three people who are going to sort of talk about this. We want to talk about things like, what were the roles expected to do? You saw in the language of the invitation, who do they report to? Meaning, as we saw these roles created, what were the expectations of these roles? And then I think, fairly or unfairly, what have these roles done in the last 3 years, right? I mean, I think we want to unpack that. So the last thing I want to say is that we won't be able to touch on, we saw several of the questions that have come in. We won't be able to touch on all of them. We have a couple of questions, but please continue to put your questions in the chat and we'll try to get to some of them. By seeing the list of people who actually have RSVP'd to this, we know that there's a great appetite. The other thing we just wanted to highlight is that we're not here to say there's one way. As someone who visits museums often around the world, as I travel for work and for personal sort of enjoyment, we know that we can click on many sites and see museum plans or statements in support of EDI or sort of targets that people want to have. What we're here to do is to have a dialogue about things we've seen that have worked and things we know that are not working from people who've actually done the work. As opposed, I say this as a diversity practitioner, oftentimes people are talking about us and the way we do the work, and we're not talking about how we do the work or why we're choosing a path that we're choosing. So I'm glad you all are here. Please get your questions ready. And with that, my first question to all of the panelists is, and this is the hardest question probably of all, but tell us about these roles over the last 3 years. Each of you, just what have you seen, right? From 2020 to 2023, what have you been seeing in your roles? Virajita, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you to AAMC and all our colleagues for being here today and the participants as well. I'm really honored to be here. I will speak to the fact that I joined Minneapolis Institute of Art in this role in 2022. So I missed the beginning part, partly because this was the inaugural role. My prior experience comes from higher education, University of Minnesota. So what I am seeing is, as you mentioned, Tanya, the sort of a rush, right, to appoint people in these roles. But I think I want to be clear that in the context of MIA, as our museum is called, it builds on, let's say, the legacy and the work that staff have been doing for a long time. There were other previous roles, like a DEI manager role, that happened earlier. It was the inflection point of George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis, where we are located, that kind of brought everything to a head, shut things down, and then led to this reimagination at the board level, as well as at, within the museum staff side as well, that then led to the institution of this position. So I think just to give insight into my role, I work with the board on specific committees. I'm responsible for DEI work within the museum, which also includes 2 departments, a DEI department, as well as I oversee the HR department, which is a structural big change that isn't happening necessarily everywhere. And then I also lead the community inclusion initiatives and all of that. So as you can tell, it's a really big job and it's impossible to get it all right all the time. But what is very powerful is that it's set up in a way that is inherently, and this is of course my approach as well, to a partnership within the museum. So the CDIO is not just the only person that does the work, but does it in partnership with every corner of the museum. So I'll stop there to let others share what they have.
Thank you. Reyahn.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you also to all of our many people on this on the long list of people who've said they're attending. It's fantastic that there's such interest. So I'm a bit of an interloper in this conversation in the sense that I've never been a professional DEI officer. I bring to this my experience primarily as a CEO in 2020, needing to lead DEI change. And I think I'd say, I'll keep it short because it's just introductory, but I think I'd say that being in a small to medium-sized organization that didn't have a DEI officer was both, and trying to make genuine change, was both a challenge and a blessing. So it was a massive challenge to me personally, because I didn't know about the kind of HR stuff that I needed to address. I didn't, I think there's a whole thing that we could unpick about the senior leadership need to protect a charity and how that conflicts with the inattention of actually uncovering what's going on in order to deal with it in an organization. So I was facing those challenges. And on the other hand, it was a blessing, because the only way that we were going to be able to make change was through really looking at ourselves as a senior team and figuring out how we were going to put ourselves through the work in order to get to the position where we could confidently lead our organization to change properly. And I think in a funny way, having to do that ourselves, so it was messy and dirty and difficult, I think it meant that actually we did, we really took it on, and it couldn't be passed to anybody else. So I think, and I'm proud of my team because they took it on too, and that wasn't always easy for them, but they really did. So, I felt like we really did move. And so that's what I bring to it, is that kind of experience of the messy side, learning as you go.
Thank you. Ali, how would you answer that?
Right. Yes. Well, just to say hello to everyone that's listening, and thank you again, Tanya, and the AAMC and the Art Fund for inviting me to speak. Just on terms of the role, so I've been in a D&I role in some guise pretty much most of my adult life. So when I've been able to kind of sit back and watch the EDI, or we call it EDI in the UK, change over the years, and that shift that happened when George Floyd was murdered happened quite, as we all know, really quite quickly, and the mind shift had to adapt accordingly in all institutions, in all organizations, and that kind of left the speed at which that had to happen required people to come in and fill a vacuum that had kind of opened up a chasm of required knowledge and expertise, which there were bits of. And then what I found was when I started to communicate with other organizations, I realized that they were taking this piece of work really seriously, but they just weren't sure how to do it. So they started to appoint leads. So in an HR function, they started to bolt on EDI on the back of various business partner roles or whatever the role was. And that seemed to be part of the answer for those institutions. What that left us with was still a vacuum in knowledge. So in the UK, we operate on a kind of on a 9 protected groups, 9 protected characteristics. So and at the V&A, we have an all-inclusive approach, so that we cover disability, LGBTQ+. So the whole group of people that are out there from marginalized groups, but also we're looking at socioeconomic groups from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So that vacuum is still, as I listen and I talk with individuals across the UK in this space, in the arts and culture, there is still more learning that needs to be done. And I'm not saying I'm the fountain of all knowledge and other people aren't. I'm just saying that as well as I am learning all the time, I've witnessed other people, and we're trying to kind of we're at a point potentially where we need to sort of standardize what's going on. So my role could be in HR, it could be in the strategy team, it could be in our delivery arms. So that way, when there's when there's so many unknowns, it becomes very difficult for that unknown to seat itself, whether it is a person or as an idea or a set of principles. And that person is charged with doing a massive cultural shift in an organization. And when we talk cultural shift, I mean, you can align it to sustainability and climate change. That's how big the shift has to be. And one final point is, if you are situated in HR, for example, your focus tends to be naturally around the workforce. If you're sat within strategy or within, you know, your delivery arm, in our case, collections or programs, it's much more visitor focused. So that's why some kind of real synergy needs to happen so that we can all work to one sort of template almost.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, and what I'm hearing from all of you are a couple of things I just want to highlight, which, you know, one is the magnitude of the role, right? And I think, Reyahn, just you talking about being a leader and sort of leaders stepping into that role. Ali, you talking about this knowledge piece, right? We were all, people were thrust into having to respond. You know, I'm a mindfulness practitioner, as many of you know, and we talk about the difference between responding and reacting. And I think just in hearing of what you all were talking about, there was a lot of reacting, right? Oftentimes without having all the pieces. I know we talk about burnout later, but Ali, I just have to say, one of the things that's become really clear to me in talking to diversity professionals across the board is, you know, in, say, New York City, where I'm seated, you know, March is when we sort of shut down, right? Because of the COVID pandemic. And, you know, we had obviously we're hit very hard by COVID. And May of that same year, so we're thinking 2020 is when this happened. So people who talk about the pandemic in a space, those of us in the diversity world have a very different view of that period of time. I don't have the same memory of like not working as hard or enjoying being home as much, because I had worked harder than I'd ever worked before, with multiple time zones, virtually in multiple countries. And I really think that's important to talk about. I mean, there's a whole body of research that's out now, and I think will be growing around why this focus, right, happened so much. Could the pandemic have something to do with it? What's the connection between these things? But I just have to say, hearing you all talk, I'm reminded that we didn't have that pause, many of us, that some people had, because of the work, the urgency, and Ali, that people were sort of plugging, you know, holes in essence, right? I saw that in one of the questions someone asked, and I want us to just pin this, that a lot of people are now writing letters to the museums and the state arts institutions asking for them to respond. But Ali, I'm going to stick with you for a minute. I mean, you started to talk about this, and you talked about how it's called EDI in the UK, and most of the UK. I've seen it called other things too, right? Justice is often added, belonging is often added, accessibility is added. You talked in our prep call about language and the importance of language. Can you talk a little bit more about this?
Yeah, well, we've sort of been having some discussions in the V&A about language, which is really important because, you know, some philosopher once said, I think, language is the seat of being. So, you know, that's where poetry comes from. That's how our being expresses itself, through some kind of art poetic form. But it's really important in the EDI space because it's part of your identity. Language can link directly to your identity, which is why it's quite a sensitive thing to talk about. I think I'll give an example. In the UK, since Boris Johnson, it was Boris Johnson who actually instigated this piece of work. There was a paper written by government around the term of the acronym BAME, which in the UK stands for Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic. Now, there is it's a strange phenomenon in the sense that it's a term, an acronym that's hated by both the right and the left, which is a kind of strange thing because both the right and the left agree on one thing. And they also cite that this is communities don't want this term. So then that led us to a conversation about how do we address language and our work. And then typically, and I don't mean this disparagingly, but typically we tend to look to the US because the US is at the front, and anything that happens is a kind of understood piece. An idea is that what happens in America, more or less 10 years, it will come into 5 to 10 years, it will come to the UK. So that was the discussion that we're having around the term global majority and BAME. So we needed to kind of unpick, and it's still a discussion going on. And I think we can start using language in ways that can be really impactful for people's lived experience. And we need to kind of be mindful of that. And yet at the same time, it can be a bit of a, you can respond to these ideas of language almost like firefighting, because you're trying to solve this kind of language issue, and then suddenly another one comes, because if you're talking about all life, everyone, has an opinion about something. It's just trying to calm the situation down and try and get some common ground. And language will change. It's an evolving kind of phenomenon, but I think it's definitely should be discussed, but I don't always know if it leads to a concrete answer.
Yeah, thank you, Ali. Virajita, you said, you've talked about the fact that this is every day, everyone's work. What does that mean? And what does that look like in terms of doing this work?
Great question. Thank you. And I just wanted to tag on to what Ali said for a minute on the ground. We have a BIPOC employee resource group, and essentially we are in the middle of that question, because does BIPOC represent the group? So, one of our members raised the question, and it was very clear that while on one hand it creates affinity, on the other hand, it boxes people up. And this is the challenge with any kind of, semantic labels, because they cannot express our full identities and who we are, and so on. So I just wanted to start there. And going back to your question, could you repeat it one more time? Sorry.
Sure. You talked about that this work in everybody's work, everyone's work every day.
Thank you. So I think this goes to this notion of, for me, on a couple levels. One is that we're talking about complex systems, within an institution, and the transformation of these systems. That means that any one person is not able to make that transformation happen. It has to be necessarily a collective endeavor. So that's one sort of key thought. The other is, I firmly believe in this notion of partnership. It sort of comes from cultural transformation theory, the work of Reyahn, Eisler, and others. Partnership studies is a field, which says that in any organization, any social institution, there are two, there's a continuum. One on the leaning into partnership, and there may be, democracy, et cetera, are, examples of that. There is no pure partnership, I believe. And the other leaning into domination. And we've seen sort of many versions of that. And in any organization, both could coexist depending on structures and adoptions of, how people operate. So I guess when I speak about, DEI being everybody's everyday work, it's really about leaning into this notion that we are in it together and we all have to play our part, and we have to do it together to really flip the system into the next version of it, which we desperately need. Does that answer?
Yeah, no, great. I mean, I was taking notes. The other thing it makes me think of is John Powell's work on othering and belonging. And he
Right.
talks about, true belonging is when, and this to me just really brings that belonging out of what some people feel too squishy space. But he says that real belonging is when you're co-creating what's next.
Exactly.
So you're not just telling someone here, right? But you're saying
Right.
we're co-creating what's next.
Exactly. And maybe practically what that means is that I and my team will partner with the curators when we are faced with sort of an exhibit that's getting social media input on why would we show Spanish colonial art? Why would your museum that's committed to DEI, so then we can partner and actually say, how do we acknowledge this? Or we can partner with sort of security staff when there's a visitor comment on something. And that needs to be addressed, or the guides and so on. So I guess, that everybody's everyday work means that it's happening everywhere, but then we are doing it in connected ways.
Great, thank you. Reyahn, you talked about, and I really want to dig into this because this comes up a lot, this question of data and using data effectively. Can you talk a little bit more about your thoughts about data? And for those listening, because I get this question all the time, what data would you suggest people collect? And Ali, Virajita, I'm curious what you might say about that too. But Reyahn, I'd love to hear your thoughts on data.
Yeah, thank you. So what I mean by data is clear evidence of a need to change. I think that's one of the things for me. Because, sometimes people have a sense of what's going on in their organization, but it's often anecdotal. It's the people they happen to know. And it could be about good work that's happening. And so they think everything's lovely and rosy because we're doing that fantastic exhibition over there that's, framing diverse artists or whatever it's doing, decolonizing. Meanwhile, someone else in the organization is saying, no, it's really terrible. I've seen these terrible things happen to my colleagues. So the data is actually getting an understanding of what is the baseline in your organization right now. And, so I think when a lot of organizations, and I would say probably York Museums Trust was guilty of that too, when I was CEO there, put out statements without actually knowing our data on all of this. And you very kindly shared a report by Russell Reynolds Associates, Tanya, and I really liked what Jafarey said there about public disclosure of data really matters. And it's not just about your audience, it's about recruitment. I'm really interested in attrition. It's one thing to appoint people, but are they feeling that they belong, or are they leaving within 6 months or a year or 2 years? And then the point he makes is that public disclosure of data leads to prioritization. And in this country, Arts Council England, I'll do a very rare thing. I'll do a positive shout out for a funder. So Arts Council England do publish the diversity figures of their organisations that they regularly fund. And I think that's a really good thing because it does make trustees and others aware that these things matter where they might not have done. Very simply put, to answer your question about what is the data, I think one of the simplest things is actually surveying staff, but a very focused survey, not an HR general engagement survey, but a survey focused on EDI, and asking simple questions like, have you seen examples of people being treated badly because of where they come from, or whatever it is? Just simple questions that people can answer, and then you can end up with a much clearer signal of what the culture is really like in all the different teams across your organization. And what I found was that when I was trying to make change, because I was discovering things, it was only really when I got that data that I was able to persuade my trustees and others that we really needed to make that change.
Great, thank you. Virajita, any thoughts on data?
Yeah, absolutely. I agreed with everything Reyahn said. I think data is really critical. I mean, you mentioned clear evidence, Reyahn, and I see it as a biometric, if you will, so that we know how we're doing and then build on that. But I do resist the idea as a former academic, please, you'll understand, but I resist the idea of a data as an end in itself, right? Because I found that a way to actually stall efforts, because it becomes about the preciousness of the data and the perfection of the data, et cetera. So that's not what we're talking about. But as the sense of data literacy and then also transparency and clarity. And so in our context, we've been using that more towards the sort of, our efforts to increase representational diversity, to actually assess sort of where are we in terms of our diversity in the organization. And then also sharing where we're at and putting that in context, both sort of regionally and nationally, and sharing it with our staff across the museum. Because oftentimes there's this lack of clarity, even with staff who are really committed to social justice, not knowing if, is our organization moving in the right direction or not. And so that kind of communication about that data is really important internally. And I'll also mention something that's happening. I'm pleased to see happening at the board level, that we've just the board has just gone through a board climate assessment conversation and sort of focus groups around that. And that data was shared just at our last week's board meeting. And, there was hour-long reflection on what that's revealing and all of that. So all of that is really important and sound practice to really accelerate the work.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that comes up almost every time we do one of these, the question about the board. So I appreciate you naming that, how you're engaging the board. I want to ask you all a question, and we talked about this in the prep call, but 3 years later, statements, pledges, all of the data that we have, what's still not being discussed? That those on this call who are either watching now or who are going to be watching the recording, what are the topics related to EDI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, belonging? What is not being discussed?
I can come in here, Tanya. And I say this, with sadness. I think that, a lot more is being discussed that needs to happen. And I can see organizations that might have thought different, might have wanted to hold back from, for example, thinking about where their objects came from, how they were acquired, what was done. And actually, incidentally, that's a whole nother data question. The amount of research that is needed in our collections because of where they came from and how they were acquired is, phenomenal as a challenge. But I think one of the issues that I think is not being dealt with really is Islamophobia. And I associate that also with Palestine and the difficulty of talking about Palestine, and actually sensitive conversations about anti-Semitism as well. And these are really difficult subjects, and they're not being talked about because they're so difficult, I think. And I feel quite nervous actually even raising them. But I also feel that, that is a massive issue. And in this country, you just need to listen to, almost our daily news. And there was an item last night on Channel 4 News interviewing a woman about asylum seekers being housed in an airbase near her. And really, the interview was very good because the journalist, Abdash Nassoni, really, really gently probed why. Why are you so worried about this? Why are you so worried about this? And ultimately, it came down to the fact they were Muslim. And that's quite overt, clear prejudice. And so actually, and this lady was trying to kind of express it in as nice a way as she possibly could. But nevertheless, it's so revealing about the attitudes towards other people who come from other places and how we deal with the reality of diversity in our society today. So I'm sorry, I've gone a bit off the track, but I think these are the issues that are really difficult and are hard to engage with, but that we haven't really started engaging with.
Thanks. Ali, any thoughts on that? You brought up some thoughts in the prep call.
Yes, no, I completely agree and concur with Reyahn. There are conversations happening out in the real world, as it were, that haven't kind of seeped into the organization on all fronts. And I think the issue of Islamophobia, refugees and asylum seekers is very, very sensitive in the UK, and I'm sure in the US as well. And it's something that if your original question is not what is not being addressed, I would probably say exactly the same. There are other sort of almost opposing, but not opposing in a kind of opposite way, but I've done some work with ex-armed forces. And you wouldn't think that there's any relation to people who've been in the armed forces, but a lot of people are coming back home with big, life-changing disabilities. And they have challenges around housing, they have challenges around employment, they have challenges around all the kind of basics. And it's not necessarily a direct link into EDI, but there are people that are suffering to whatever extent, and we're not quite registering that suffering. And I don't know why, but it's just happening.
Thank you. Virajita, were you coming off of mute?
Yeah, thank you. I really resonate with what you've both said here. I wonder if this has also to do with mindset, right? We've been socialized into ways of thinking. Some of it are actually, unconscious. We're not even aware. We hold these beliefs that are racist and so on. But it is all coming up to the surface through the, even the interview that you mentioned. And it's time to look at that more deeply. A couple things came to mind, what you said, both said reminded me in social media today. There was this powerful reminder where someone had posted that, why is it that the world is scrambling to save, 5 people who have gone on a pleasure trip in a submersible and are able to watch boatloads of refugees just passively doing nothing, drowning. So it's just that, we have sort of these systems in place that have, that are assumptions of whose life is valuable and so on, that are informing us. And it's up to each of us and us collectively to really examine that and say, okay, what do we need to change here, and where this is coming from? And I think, I lost my train of thought, but basically it is a mindset and an awareness issue. I also think it's a commitment to change. Maybe I picked up again on what I was thinking. What I've noticed of what's missing is us realizing that we are also past the binary, in the sense that the binary still exists. I'm not saying it's gone away, the white and other things, but it's become more nuanced. In Minnesota, for example, these articles reached the New York Times, but there were some conflicts, situations in academic institutions around religion and diversity and expression in art and so on, that were also about sort of nuances between orthodoxies and liberal notions of what that should be. And it wasn't about sort of the typical binaries. And I think, how do we start to see that we have to ramp up on our openness and ability to navigate these complexities, and yet we're kind of working with tropes that have been sort of inserted in the past in good ways at that moment, but now we need to move past that. So
yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I think you brought up something which we can go into a whole other conversation, and we can, but I want to just flag a little bit. That's definitely a hot conversation in the US around the skill set, right? And Ali's point about knowledge. And so we've put people in these roles sometimes. And what I'm hearing you all talk about is talking about difficult topics, understanding social cultural history, being able to facilitate difficult conversations, understanding sort of language and syntax, Virajita, understanding intersectionality, all of these things. And what we talk about in the US is that many of the people in some of these roles, they were hired and don't necessarily have the background. And then there's this conversation around professionalization of the field, right? So in other words, does that mean that we send people to academies or schools, or, the proliferation of certificate programs here related to EDI and DEI, and what does that mean? And then, I want to just say this, and I have to put this out there, and how these diversity leader roles are under attack, both internally and externally, and then trying to figure out the skill set related to sort of ramp up around this. A couple of other things, and I want to just get this in because it's kind of connected to this. There was a question that came in about class, socioeconomic status. And can any of you talk about sort of that as missing from the conversation?
Yeah, I can chip in if you want. Yeah, so when I joined the VNA 18 months ago, I put together quite a clear strategy for EDI and the VNA. And when I did the presentation to the board, it was good. They said, well, what about the kind of elitist perceptions that we have, and also the kind of our audience demograph, you know, who are the visitor demograph, who are the people? And we've got quite a clear kind of group of people that come to the VNA. And how can we make a shift on that? I would say that with certain activities, with certain groups, when we're talking about the unknown, it's even more difficult with socioeconomic, because the group and the band is so big, and in a way it's kind of more hidden. I know it seems a strange phenomenon, but what's happened is that we've traditionally tended to put certain groups in the corner. That's a name, a bit from a film, isn't it? So I'm working with our local borough, which is Kensington and Chelsea, which happens to be the richest borough in the UK. The north part has some of the poorest communities in the north of the borough in the UK. So what I'm doing is that we need to identify those groups and work with them so that they see that their perception, their lived experience of the VNA isn't that it's an elitist, that we are reaching out and we're going to these communities and we're opening our doors and our arms to them and welcoming them in. And that's pretty much all we can do. I'm hesitant necessarily to change drastically what the offer is, because we have a really kind of fixed amount of stuff, you know, and it's broad. It's about the Renaissance, it's about ancient Greece, it's about the classical arts, and it's about design. And these are kind of standpoints in history. What we need to do is not just teach people who haven't been aware of them, but take from our collection some of the things that would be relevant to them. So that's why we wouldn't just turn up with a bust of Socrates. We'd turn up with a kind of, you know, something much more relevant and appropriate. And that, but we're going in with a VNA badge. So we're kind of, I don't want to be kind of Trojan horse about this, but we need to kind of think about creative ways how we can touch diverse communities that haven't been touched. If at best, these communities would have had a school trip, you know, when they were 5, 6 years old, and that would have been their experience of a museum. And we need to shift the dial on that.
Thanks. We have a bunch of questions come in, but this connects to one of the questions. We talked about this not being fashionable or trendy, but sort of continuing to center change and change at the structural and system level. I'm wondering if you can talk about how do we make sure that happens, that it's not a trendy piece. I mean, there are questions already to us about the siloed nature of diversity initiatives, right? There are questions about sort of fundraising that are coming up in terms of keeping, in fact, the structures of, you know, that exist and who's donating and what. We're not even talking yet about restitution. So, you know, just how do we think about this, Reyahn, maybe I see you coming off of mute, and really centering structural systemic change?
Wow, well, that's an enormous question. But before I answer it, can I just follow up on some of what Ali was saying? And actually, I think it then kind of actually does tie in to the question about systemic change. I was listening to the earlier webinars in this series, and Charlotte Holmes, who works at Birmingham Museums Trust, was talking about the work that Birmingham has done. And quite recently, Birmingham has completely rehung the initial room you go into when you arrive at Victorian Round Room and rehung it in a way that foregrounds completely different groups. And they worked with Muqtada, who is an activist, who is intersectional in the sense that, yes, he's South Asian, but he's also really works on working class issues. And, you know, by centering somebody like that in a city like Birmingham with its diversity and its class and so many young people, they're doing something really exciting. And I don't think it's, and I'm just repeating in a way what Charlotte said, but, you know, Birmingham Museums Trust is the most amazing museum and has been for decades. You know, so when I arrived at Birmingham as a curator in 1997, I had left the National Gallery where I'd been in documentation, and I could not believe, I was just overwhelmed with joy because I discovered a senior leader and a curator who were people of colour working alongside me, and I hadn't known that that was going to be possible. And that, so it felt like such a blossoming experience for me to have that experience back in the 90s at Birmingham. And Birmingham has that long tradition, and it's not accidental. I think, you know, one of the things, they've moved to charitable status now. When I was there, they were part of the local authority. And there are some things about being part of a big city council that are quite frustrating. But I think what's really powerful about these local authority museums in the UK, and I'm not sure quite what the governance equivalent is in the States. I guess it's sort of like Brooklyn Museum might be sort of equivalent, is that because they're working for councillors, ultimately who are elected, those councillors are saying to those members of staff in the museum all the time, what are you doing for my constituents? And so actually those museums were forced to think about, are they really reaching the people in North Kensington who are putting in votes? You know, are they really reaching these different communities? And I think that left a really strong legacy for those former local authority museums. And my only fear, I think that moving to charitable status is really good for them, but I think my only fear is that they don't lose that sense of, you know, if you lead a city museum, you are doing it for the people. So I think the systemic bit there is actually that tie to the politics was quite useful in the English context at its time. It had all kinds of other problems, which is quite good that they've separated now. But, you know, I think keeping something of that sense of responsibility in your programming. Going back to the systemic thing a bit, I think co-creation and co-partnership, which is what some of what Birmingham was doing, is also really important. So it's not, you know, us selecting and sending objects out. It's actually developing the relationships with the people in the cities and the communities who are already working with those groups. And I think museums have to stop being so arrogant, really, about making assumptions that, you know, our partnership officer can do everything. The partnership person needs to partner with people who already know and are living in and working with these communities, proper partnerships. So I think for many of us, for many organizations without huge resources particularly, I think that partnership piece is one of the key ways to make a difference. I've spoken enough. I haven't talked about the whole, you know, internal change, but I'll hand over to the experts for that one.
Well, actually, good segue into a next question. So, you know, the question is, do you feel that diversity initiatives are too siloed within institutions? And the person says, I feel like the diversity of exhibitions is catching up quickly, collections somewhat, but then staffing not at all. Any thoughts on that? The siloed nature, but just that sort of listing, that exhibitions are catching up, collections somewhat, and then staffing not at all. Any thoughts?
Well, I could speak to that a little bit because, you know, I've come to see, and again, from my background in academia also, that silos are almost predictable and natural, right? I mean, you have your specific mission and you have sort of how you do things. And so, and that goes back to the systemic change that we have to actually counteract that intentionally. Like, what are we doing to disrupt the silos and to partner across that? And I do, this question is great because I think it's almost like we have to work on all of those fronts all the time, right? It can't be that we just work on collections or exhibits and so on. And in our instance, because of that integration of HR and DEI, I think we were able to take on the staffing piece more actively. And this is also, I mean, it's a structural thing, but we committed to sort of really examining our hiring processes and our recruiting all the way from where we post, what requirements, what degrees we require, et cetera, to actually then changing our interview process, having questions in the interview process and educating our managers and any other staff who are interested and so on. So I think a lot of it is in the details of it, like if you're willing to take that on. And I think we've assured everyone around that we've changed some things, but please know that this will continue to change, because as we learn more about what's working and not working, we will change. So I think it is a combination of all of that, and that's the way you break down silos. I do think also trust building is important, which is sometimes challenging for these roles, as Tanya, you pointed out, you know, the internal pushbacks you get for doing what you're trying to do. That how do we build trust? I do believe, you know, I don't know who said that, but change happens at the speed of trust. And that's sort of my interest, like how do we continue to build trust? Because otherwise we are fighting and, you know, pushing back on each other rather than together leveraging and the systems change that needs to happen.
Thank you for that. I want to ask a question before getting to another question, because I think this comes up a lot about burnout. And, you know, several of you talked about in the prep call about how this conversation about this work, EDI, diversity, equity work, people who are in leadership roles in this work, is connected to conversations about burnout, the great resignation, and quiet quitting. Although I read a wonderful piece today about just not using quiet quitting and how it sort of blames the quote victim, right? Like it retakes the power structure in a very not helpful way. But when we think about this language and we think about these sort of phenomena that are being focused on, what are your thoughts on this? And actually, I would say not just burnout, but sort of the focus on mental health in general, right? Mental health, well-being, diversity, equity, and inclusion, the great resignation. What's the thread for you all with these topics? Ali, I see you came off of mute.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on the last question about silo. I think it's some kind of organized, it can be a kind of an institutional introvertism, you know, when you're kind of so, you grow smaller. Does that exist? But yeah, you grow, you shrink. And the only way to get out of that into kind of a positive is to communicate and make sure that you're being heard and that your message is being communicated on a regular basis. And that's how behavior change happens, is by that communication. And that lends itself perfectly to building trust, is by being and being honest when you're doing that. And even the small changes will land. Oh, that's another EDI initiative that's doing really well. Great. Oh, there's another bit of training, or there's another report or something, there's another exhibition. So all of these changes end up giving root to a kind of a much less siloed position. Just in terms of burnout, I think burnout can happen by a number of ways. One is that, when you talk about all the DEI professionals out there, a couple of things that you need to kind of tag on to that. One is, how much budget do they have? What kind of resource budget? So if I was sustainability director of sustainability, what kind of budget would I have? What kind of resource do I have? And what influence do I have on decision-making processes on senior level management? And when an officer, a DEI officer, makes a clear decision, this is something, what are the layers of of agreement that have to be taken before that actually gets instigated. And those factors lead not just to kind of, how am I going to achieve this with hardly anything in my bag? And the call is so great for huge structural and organizational change. And inevitably that will lead you to having a sense of empowerment, lacking empowerment. And that's kind of, that doesn't sit well with anyone. It just builds stress. And I've seen so many DEI professionals sort of hand in notice and just move into fields that are kind of less stressful. Because as I said earlier, a good percentage of my time is just firefighting from the external world into the organization and responding. So, and that takes emotional energy. That takes a lot of it's an emotional drain, because you're having these sensitive conversations with people who are, rightly emotional about an area that affects them and also potentially their work.
So we have 1 minute. Any thoughts on what keeps you motivated before I turn this over to Rachel at the Art Fund? Any thoughts about what keeps you motivated or optimistic? Not in a Pollyanna way, but in a way, to Ali's point about being able to continue to do the work and take care of ourselves and be whole and healthy. Any thoughts about that?
Can I come in with a slightly sort of tangential answer to that, which is because I was thinking about what Ali was saying and your question about silos. I think there's a real difference between making some EDI changes that are kind of broadly, everybody can celebrate, like a lovely menopause policy coming in or whatever it is, and the really difficult change in ourselves and in our relationships with others that we need to take through if we're going to make systemic change in these areas. And I think that relates to burnout, because the people who decide they want to go down that authentic journey are not always met with understanding, because a lot of people would rather do the surface thing that looks okay because you've got a few initiatives. I hope that makes sense. I hope, I'm not stepping out of line there saying that in front of two people who are professional EDI officers. So I think that's one thing. So that does relate to your question, Tanya, because for me then, it was so important when I was going through that kind of journey with my team, frankly, to have a husband who got it and said, this work you're doing is important, you have to keep doing it. And I needed him saying that as much as any kind of other sort of support. And so I'm sure we've all got those networks, but if you don't, it's really important. Museum Detox in the UK is a fantastic resource for people to kind of support each other. And actually, I was thinking about this because I knew we were coming to this question. For me, music is the other one. Get up and have a little boogie, or for me, a La Jafarey song, Something Inside So Strong is always what I turn to. So it's finding those things that you can turn to something that gives you power.
I just wanted to add something quick. So I've made it sort of asking the question about what are we doing about well-being for all staff? And we've introduced well-being and resilience sessions since I got here, which becomes also supporting my own well-being. So that, tying that together. And then the other thing is actually connecting to the art, because you can be so busy doing the work and disconnect from the art itself. And that is something I want to work against and will sustain us.
And just for me, very quickly, I think it's the next generation. So I have a lot of optimism because of the next generation.
So please join me. Thank you all very much. I really appreciate your honesty, your sharing your thoughts, your preparation. With that, I'm going to turn this over to Rachel. So thank you all for joining us. Rachel.
Oh, thank you, Tanya. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Browning. I'm Interim Director of Programme and Policy at Art Fund. I just wanted to round things off today by saying a huge thank you to our brilliant speakers, Ali, Virajita and Reyahn, for their time and such a rich and thought-provoking conversation. It's been fantastic. Huge thanks also to our moderator, Tanya, who's hosted the session so expertly and for including lots of fantastic questions from the audience. I'd also like to express my warm thanks to our dear partners at AAMC and their brilliant team for managing today's session, and of course our audience for engaging so enthusiastically and thoughtfully with the topics raised. So as a reminder, this is part 2 in the Beyond Statements Revisited series, with the final part taking place next week on Wednesday, 28th of June at 11 a.m. New York time, 4 p.m. UK time. The webinars are all free, and please do share it with colleagues if they'd like to attend. Registration is going to remain open until the end of the series, and you can catch up with the series on AAMC's YouTube channel. I'm honoured to be moderating the final session, where we will discuss several new studies, surveys and analyses that have investigated the current state of the sector, shared transparently their findings, and sought to generate ways forward for a diverse, inclusive and accessible visual arts community. I'll be joined by an inspirational panel, including Errol Francis, Deborah Cullen-Morales, Mia Locks and Susan Puisan-Locke. So registration is still open if you want to encourage a colleague to attend. We hope to see you there next week. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you soon.